presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Ma'am, I want you to take a look at exhibit number 242.001 and go to the entry dated Thursday, September 13th, 2007. Read it. When you're done reading it, you let me know.
September 13th, did you say?
I have it tabbed for you right there. See it? Let me do it again. Here.
I'm sorry.
Are you done reading it?
Yes, I am.
Why don't you just turn it the other way with the binding up and then down. Well, that's all right. Anyway, with regard to that, that is something that you read as part of your investigation into this case, right?
Correct.
And it's something that you remember reading, right?
Yes.
And it is something that you used in reaching whatever assessment you reached in this particular case, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that that talks about is a trip to Havasupai, right?
Correct.
And it references a number of people going with them to Havasupai, correct?
Correct.
It's the defendant who goes, one of the people, right?
Yes.
One of the other people is Travis Alexander, correct?
Yes.
Somebody by the name of Daniel Freeman also goes, correct?
Yes.
And Desiree Freeman, right?
Yes.
And there's some writing there, and this is written by the defendant, correct?
Correct.
That's your understanding of it, right?
Yes.
And this is part of the corroboration that you used in reaching your assessment, right?
Yes.
In other words, this is the collateral source that you found to be, for lack of a better term, accurate, so that you could then compare it to what the defendant was saying and to what other people were saying, right?
I didn't consider this a collateral source.
So it's a primary source then, right?
It's a source from the defendant.
So you consider that to be a primary source then, right?
No, I look at collaterals as just other people other than the defendant. Not that it's better or worse, but that
Right.
it's
And in
direct.
this particular entry, the defendant bemoans the fact that things did not start out very well on the trip to Havasupai, correct?
Correct.
And she indicated there were some tense moments there at the beginning, right?
Yes.
And then she also indicated that Mr. Alexander apologized to you, correct?
Correct.
And she said that, according to her, that he was 90% responsible for the argument, right?
Yes.
One
That
of
he
the other
said he
people-
was.
Pardon? What did
She
you say?
says that he said he was 90%.
Right.
Yeah.
Not the gist of it. He's saying that he's 90% responsible for the argument, right?
Correct.
And did you consider talking to Daniel Freeman about that incident to see if it actually corresponded to what's actually in that book?
I read the Freeman statements, but
So the answer is no, you did not talk to him, correct?
I did not talk to him.
And that being the case, you are left with that rendition there as something that, in your view, since it's a primary source, is something that's truthful, correct?
It's something that I took to be truthful, yes.
Right. And if it's truthful, though, would it cause you to reevaluate how you viewed all of these entries in the journal if it were found that perhaps that entry was not accurate? Would it cause you any problems?
Is this a hypothetical?
Let's assume that it's a reality and that whatever's out there indicates that what's in that journal is not accurate. It's not, you took it to be truthful, now find out that perhaps that's not what happened. Would that cause you any problems?
Sure.
And it would cause you problems with regard to all the other entries, right?
Depending on what I had collaboration
Sure.
to defend.
But if you only had the journal entries and one of them turns out to be untrue, it could then be, if you will, a cancer that is spread throughout all of these journals, right?
Objection is to mischaracterizing this journal entry as untrue, making it as a statement rather than a hypothetical.
Overruled. You may answer the
Go ahead.
question.
If I'm assuming this is untrue,
Right.
that it would make me look much more carefully at the other journal entries and look to the other collaborative sources.
And wouldn't it cast doubt then on whatever statements the defendant gave to you if they corroborated that, right?
If they corroborated,
What's in that journal right now?
I would look at all my corroborating data, Mr. Martinez.
Did you talk to the defendant about that particular trip to Havasupai?
Yes,
And she told you that what's in there is correct, right?
correct.
So if, for example, in this case, Daniel Freeman came in and testified and indicated something different than that, that would be problematic, wouldn't it?
Objection mischaracterizes Mr. Freeman's testimony.
Overruled. You may answer the question.
Is this hypothetical? Because I have no evidence of this.
Right, you were not here when he testified. But
No.
assume hypothetically that he said something different.
If you propose a hypothetical
Well,
that I have no evidence of, you want me to say what I
Right.
think about that hypothetical
Sure,
I have no
sure.
evidence of.
Assuming that that person came in and testified to that in this courtroom, hypothetically, all right?
Yes,
Under oath, all right?
yes.
What if Mr. Freeman came in and testified that the fight was actually started by him? I want you to assume that.
Objection mischaracterizes Mr. Freeman's testimony.
Overruled.
Assume that.
I
you do
don't,
that?
Miss Arias does not say that Mr. Alexander started the fight. They just that they had a fight.
I understand that. Assume that it was Mr. Freeman that started the fight, correct? Can you assume that for me?
I can.
And assume that there was an argument because of something that Mr. Freeman did, correct? Can you assume that for me?
Okay, you're asking me to make a lot of assumptions based
Yes.
on information I don't have.
Absolutely, that's what I'm doing. Can you do that for me?
I can go along with that.
And assume those two facts, just those two facts. Those aren't written in that September 13th, 2000 entry, is it? 2007 entry, are they?
No.
And if they were true, wouldn't that make that entry incomplete?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it's
You
not a
wouldn't-
detailed entry. It's
Well,
just a,
Aren't you providing an excuse, and aren't you siding with the defendant again, saying, no, it wouldn't make any difference what this other information that you gave me?
no, I'm not saying that.
Sustained.
Aren't you not looking at both sides equally when you say to me, well, it wouldn't matter, in this case, those two facts that you've added?
What I'm saying is that I try to look at the big picture.
I understand you want to look at the big picture, but...
And that this particular
Ma'am, I want you to
entry,
look at the small picture, September 13th of 2007. It's-
No. Next question.
Look just at that entry. You don't want to talk about any other entry, please.
all right,
With regard to that entry, if you found that it was incomplete and didn't include the reason for the fight, wouldn't that be important to note?
it doesn't include the reason for the fight.
I know it doesn't, But wouldn't that indicate that it's incomplete because it doesn't indicate the reason for the fight?
It's just a journal entry.
And that journal entry means nothing to you, does it? Or it does?
A standalone journal entry
Yes.
doesn't mean as much to me as when I look at the big picture.
Right, I'm just talking about this one, and I understand what you're saying.
It's incomplete, I will agree with that. There's not any description of the fight or anything.
So if it's incomplete with regard to that, and you're relying on it, it would appear that you're relying on something that's incomplete, correct?
I'm not sure that you're looking at how I rely on things.
Well, you read it, right?
Yes, I did.
You put it into your brain, this brain that you use to go through this continuum of aggression, right?
Objection argumentative.
Overruled.
Right?
That I,
You put that information, after reading it, assimilated it into your brain, and then made a decision based on this continuum of aggression that you talked about, right? That's what it's part of what you did with regard to that, right?
I told you the way I used the continuum. So I'm not putting it into the continuum. I'm putting it into the big
All right, so you took this,
barrel of information that I've gotten.
so you took this entry and you put it into this big barrel of information that you have, right?
Correct.
What if that's a cancerous, if you will, or invalid entry that you put in with the other information that you have there? That won't affect your view or opinion in this case?
Objection assumes facts, not evidence.
Overruled.
Anything can affect.
All right, specifically here in this case, we both agree, or you agree, that the reason for the fight is not there, correct?
Correct.
And so that's an omission on the writer's part, correct? To put that in there. For whatever reason, the writer didn't put it in, right?
Correct.
You don't know the reason why the writer didn't put it in, correct?
No, I don't.
It could be that it would reflect badly on the writer, right?
Objection speculation.
Sustained.
Well, with regard to this case, assume that Mr. Freeman came in and testified that the reason that the fight started was that because the defendant was being unreasonable as to the items that she was going to take on the trip. I want you to assume that.
Objection mischaracterizes Mr. Freeman's testimony.
Overruled.
Assume that. Will you do that?
So once again, you have me assuming
Yes.
facts I have no knowledge of
Absolutely.
and no evidence for.
Not no evidence. You don't have any information of it. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Correct? You weren't here when Mr. Freeman testified, were you?
No, I was not.
So assume, for purposes of looking at that journal entry, that the reason the fight started was because the defendant was being unreasonable as to the item she was going to carry on this trek. Assume that.
Objection. Mischaracterizing the testimony of Mr. Freeman.
Overruled. This is a hypothetical.
Assume that.
Judge, I would ask that it be placed as a hypothetical and not that Mr. Freeman came in and said those things.
Sustained.
Assume the hypothetical that I just gave you, please.
Okay.
All right? Assuming that. Wouldn't that cast doubt on the validity of that entry?
Yes.
And additionally, also assume, ma'am, that with regard to this fight, whatever it was, that this fight then escalated at some point and they went somewhere else, the two of them. Assume that. Can you do that? A different part of the house. Assume that, hypothetically speaking.
All right.
It doesn't talk about them going to another part of the house in that entry, does it?
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't talk about what happened at the other part of the house in that entry, does it?
No.
And it doesn't talk about what was said between the two people, if anything was said, when they were in that room, does it?
And this is all hypothetical?
Hypothetically.
Hypothetically, you're giving me a lot of things that I don't have any reason to believe, but I will go with a hypothetical if that's what you want.
Well, does it say anything there about anything happening in a bathroom?
No.
Does it say anything in that entry about anybody cursing at anybody else?
No, it does not.
Does it say anything else about how that argument was resolved, if it was resolved at all in the bathroom?
No,
So you don't have any information. That entry is an example of something that is very incomplete, right?
yes.
And so, did you talk to the defendant about this?
I did talk to the defendant about it, but I'm not recalling all the details. I'm recalling that there was, I'm recalling some of the things that the Freeman said and some of the things that Ms. Arias said, but I would need to look at the Freeman's statements about this particular.
That's not my question. Isn't it true that you talked to the defendant about this? That was my question, yes.
Yes, I talked to the defendant.
And you discussed this particular entry with her, right?
Yes,
And even though you discussed this with her, and even though you had the Freeman statement in front of you, whatever that statement may be, you still found there was nothing invalid about this particular entry. In other words, it's something that you found according to your truth gatekeeping abilities. You found that one to be true, correct?
I found it to be one piece of information that I didn't put that in the, if you're looking at it and saying, did I put that in the mix with domestic violence? No, I didn't.
I'm not asking you that, if you put it into the mix with domestic violence. Are you clear about that?
No, I wasn't clear about that.
I'm asking because you say that you take the items and you look at items that you think are truth, and then you decide to do something with them. Did you decide that this was either truthful or untruthful, given the way you approached this?
I decided that it wasn't incredibly important, but did I believe it? I thought something happened and that there was an argument, and that I believe that Mr. Alexander apologized. Yes, I did.
I'm not asking that question specifically. You read the entry for September 13th, 2007, right?
Yes, I did.
And it's the written version, correct?
Correct.
I'm asking you if you believe the written version in that exhibit. Yes or no?
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled.
Did I believe
Yes.
the limited information that was given there?
Yes. Mhm.
Did I believe there was an argument?
No, I'm not asking you that. I'm asking you about that black item that's to your left. Do you see that?
Yes, I see
It's
that,
a
but I'm
book.
not,
Ma'am, let me do it this way. It's a journal, correct?
correct.
In that journal, it's an entry for September 23, 2007, right? September 13th, 2007, right?
The 13th,
Right.
not the 23rd.
Right? This is 13th, correct?
Yes,
Do you believe that entry for September 13th, 2007, in that black book that's to your left? Yes or no?
do I believe all,
The truthfulness?
that it was just, do I
No.
believe there was an entry that said, I'm not sure what you're trying to get here.
Well,
I'm not
ma'am, you
sure.
say that you evaluate what's being told to you for the truthfulness. Didn't you just tell us that earlier today?
Yes,
I'm asking you to tell me, based on your statement that you evaluate things for the truthfulness of it, I'm asking you to tell me whether, after conducting this evaluation for truthfulness, you find that to be truthful or untruthful. That's all I'm asking you.
Objection, Judge, may we approach?
Yes, you may approach.
The entry is September 13th, 2007. You've read it, correct?
Correct.
Do you believe everything that is written in the entry of September 13th, 2007?
Do I believe everything?
Yes.
I believe the essence of it.
No, I'm not asking whether or not you believe the essence. I'm asking whether or not you believe everything that is written for the entry of September 13th, 2007.
Objection, asked to be answered.
Overruled.
I believe that
Is that yes or no, ma'am? And then you can explain.
I basically, yes, I have no reason not
All
to
right,
believe
thank
it.
you.
Okay.
Now, one of the things that you told us in taking a look at the defendant's journal was that you saw no evidence of jealousy, right?
Correct.
And that would assume that if you saw no evidence of jealousy, was that all of the entries would be complete and truthful, correct?
Not necessarily.
Well, if some entries were incomplete and untruthful, wouldn't that cast doubt on the completeness of the writings?
Yes, it could.
And so in this case, though, you took a look at all of the journals and all of the writings in the journals, and in response to a question on direct examination, you said, I saw no evidence of jealousy, correct?
That wasn't just about the journals, Mr. Martinez. That was about the other evidence as well.
Right. Assume that you looked at, fine, you looked at the other evidence too, correct?
Correct.
Well, part of what you used to look at was the journals, right?
I did use the journals as well.
And I want you to focus on the journals only for the purposes of my next questions, correct?
Okay.
And this is the journal that has this law. Whenever the defendant writes, she applies this law, correct?
The law of attraction.
Right, the law of attraction, correct? So that she wouldn't put anything negative in there, right?
She did put some negative things in the journal.
I know that you indicated that she did put some negative things in the journal, but she didn't put anything about Mr. Alexander hitting her, correct?
Right.
Didn't put anything about Mr. Alexander choking her, correct?
Correct.
Didn't put anything of any physical violence from Mr. Alexander to her, correct?
Correct.
Didn't indicate anything about this masturbatory incident to photographs in the journal by Mr. Alexander, correct?
Correct.
So if you look at these journals, they're incomplete the way you view them, right?
Yes.
And you view them as incomplete because it's your position that she didn't want to write anything negative in there because in part of the law of attraction, right?
In part.
So she was censoring herself as she was writing things in there, right?
Apparently.
Well, no, that's what you believe, though, right?
I believe she censored herself. Yes.
Right. And in censoring herself and applying the law of attraction, wouldn't it also be fair to say, if we were looking at the other side of the coin, that in terms of the question involving jealousy, that she probably was jealous and she just didn't write it down, right?
I have no evidence that she was jealous.
I know you have no evidence of that, but because of the law of attraction, she's not going to put down something that is negative. That would be negative energy to say, I'm very jealous of Mr. Alexander with all these women. That would be a negative thing under the law of attraction as you know it, right?
Saying that you're jealous would not necessarily be
No.
a negative thing.
Writing it down. We're talking about the written word, right?
Saying that she was jealous would not interfere with the law of attraction. Saying that maybe she wanted to handle the jealousy, that would be, she could do that within those parameters.
So being jealous, incredibly jealous, that's a good thing,
Objection is characterized as your testimony.
Overruled.
right?
I didn't say that.
Well, that's my question. Isn't it true that being jealous is a negative thing with negative energy associated with it, right?
Correct.
You see that in your business all the time, don't you?
I see what?
Jealousy in
Yes, I do.
couples that you counsel, don't you?
Yes, I do.
It's a real negative emotion, isn't it? In the people that you counsel, right?
It depends.
Well, okay, so it's positive in some of the couples that you counsel.
No,
Jealousy.
it's not a pattern in some of the couples that I
I'm
counsel.
not asking about pattern. I'm asking about the emotion of jealousy. In
The-
your experience, isn't that a negative emotion?
It's a human emotion.
Oh, so, but it's a positive emotion then. I'm asking you to put a perspective on it for me. Do you view it as as somebody who does this forensic evaluations in domestic violence? Do you view it as a positive emotion, jealousy?
I view it in regard to the behavior it generates. So if it generates negative behavior, then it becomes negative. It's an emotion. An emotion in and of itself doesn't have to be particularly negative unless there is very negative behavior associated with it.
Give me examples where jealousy generates positive things from it. Give me an example.
There are people who get jealous, and out of that jealousy, they step back from it, they figure it out, they then approach the person in a positive way.
No, you're talking about treatment. I'm not interested
No,
in
I'm not
treatment.
talking about treatment. I'm talking about what people do with jealousy.
Right. I'm not asking you what people do with jealousy. I want you to tell me a situation, for example, where a woman is very jealous of a man. Tell me, in that circumstance where a woman is very jealous of the man, of all the couples that you've treated, where that woman has done something positive so that we can hold jealousy as a virtue right up there with love.
Objection argumentative.
Sustained.
Give me an example of someone who is afflicted with this incredible jealousy where they do positive things with it.
You're talking about two different things. You're talking about someone who's afflicted with jealousy and someone who has become jealous. Those are very different things.
Let's assume that the defendant, you can't tell us that the defendant was not afflicted with jealousy, can you?
I can tell you I have no evidence in collateral data that she is, and not just in her journal.
Well, I'm talking about the journal. If the defendant were afflicted with jealousy, that would be a negative energy kind of thing in violation of this law that she subscribes to. Yes or no?
What do you mean by afflicted?
What do you mean by afflicted? Isn't that the term that you used just now?
No, you used the term afflicted, and I'm
You
feeding it back to you.
You didn't say a person is afflicted with jealousy?
I said it after you said it.
You believe that I was the one that started this then? Okay. There are two types of emotions with regard to jealousy. Do you remember describing them to me just now?
I said there's a difference in a pattern of jealousy, and that's basically the whole context of this testimony, is that there is a difference between, for instance, somebody being angry and somebody having a pattern that's destructive. There's a difference between somebody feeling jealous, which human beings feel, and them acting out in a jealous way and having a pattern of jealous behavior.
Let's assume a pattern of jealous behavior. That's what we're talking about. Can we assume that for purposes of this discussion?
So you're assuming...
No, I'm asking you to just think about this in terms of a pattern of jealous behavior. Can you do that?
You're asking me to hypothetical?
Yes, of course.
And a hypothetical that I have no evidence of.
It's a hypothetical, ma'am. Can you do that?
I can sure
Let's
try.
assume that the defendant has a pattern, a hypothetical pattern of jealousy. You don't see a pattern of jealousy in the journals, do you?
No, I don't.
But that lack of pattern in these journals could be because of the law of attraction, because that's a negative energy kind of emotion or pattern, right?
Objection speculation.
Well, this law of attraction, this energy that you've talked about, you're saying that a pattern of jealousy is a positive thing under the law of attraction?
I never said that.
It's a negative thing, isn't it?
A pattern of jealousy
Yes.
is a negative thing.
Right. And so that goes against the law of attraction, doesn't it? Where you put out positive vibes, right?
Yes.
And so if the defendant exhibited a pattern of jealousy throughout her life and didn't write about it in those journals, the reason could be because of the law of attraction that you've talked to us about,
Objection
right?
speculation.
Right?
Nobody has indicated she has a pattern of jealousy.
I just indicated it to you.
You've indicated it in
Objection, and this represents the
a hypothetical.
Overruled.
I indicated it to you, and you're saying that even if it's, my point is this pattern of jealousy, if there is one, would not show up in those journals because she wouldn't write about it, right?
Probably not.
And, ma'am, with regard to this pattern of jealousy, one of the things that we can look at for the pattern of jealousy is what an individual has done, in this case, the defendant, in her other relationships, right? That's something to look at, right?
Correct.
Not only is it what they do, but how they handle things, right?
Correct.
You're aware, for example, that the defendant dated somebody by the name of Robert or Bobby Juarez, right?
Correct.
And that when the defendant dated Robert or Bobby Juarez, they broke up at one point. You're familiar with that, right?
Correct.
One of the other things that the defendant testified to was that after they broke up, she got on the telephone and called Mr. Juarez.
Objection to state the entire point of that testimony.
Approach, please.
She and Mr. Juarez broke up. You knew that, right?
Correct.
After they broke up, the defendant was working at a restaurant. You're aware of that, right?
I don't remember.
If not, assume that that's what she testified to, okay?
Okay.
And she also testified that after the breakup, an older gentleman with a dog-eared Bible came into her restaurant. Assume that. Can you do that?
All right.
Do you know anything about it?
No, I don't.
And when this individual came in, the defendant testified that this individual was prophesizing the end of the world. Do you know anything about that?
No.
Assume it then. And according to the defendant, because this individual came in talking about the end of the world, she decided to pick up the phone and call Bobby Juarez. Did you know anything about that?
No.
That's what she testified to. After she picked up the phone and called Mr. Juarez, she identified herself. Assume that that's what she testified to. Do you know anything about it?
No.
He hung up on her. Assume that. In your assessment as a domestic violence person who has this schooling, in and of itself, if that's the first event, that's really not something that's too much of concern, is it?
No, it isn't.
It's just an individual, as you previously indicated, not wanting to let go, correct?
Correct.
Sometimes when people break up, one person wants to let go and the other person usually doesn't, is the way it works out, right?
Right.
Let's assume that the defendant also testified that after Mr. Juarez hung up on her the first time, that she called him a second time. Now it's beginning to get a little bit dicier because she won't go away, right?
It's not atypical. It's not unusual.
It may not be atypical, but it's not the first telephone call, it's the second one. It's now becoming, if we're going to start using the word pattern, it's now starting to become a bit of a pattern, right? Because it hasn't happened once, it's happening again, right? It's the start of a pattern, right? It could be.
It's possible,
All
but
right?
it's also typical for people to make more than one
Whether it's
call.
typical or not, I'm asking whether or not it could be the start of a pattern. That's what I'm asking.
Could be.
And during this second telephone call, assume that the defendant testified that during this second telephone call, she again was able to get a hold of Mr. Juarez. And after Mr. Juarez knew who it was, he again hung up on her. Assume that. In that relationship, assume that they get together. And after they get together, they break up again. And after they break up, Mr. Juarez is staying at his place of residence. Assume that the defendant testified to that. Do you know anything about that?
No.
Assume that the defendant then said, or that indicated that even though they were broken up, she was still attempting to contact Mr. Juarez. Assume that. She testified to that.
All right.
Objection, Judge, mischaracterizing your testimony.
Overruled. The jury is directed to recall the testimony previously provided in this trial. You may continue.
And she was doing things in this attempt to contact him. According to her, she was buying things like groceries and leaving them at his doorstep. Are you aware of anything like that?
No.
Assume that that's part of the facts in this case. You previously testified that people who are starting to have this pattern, that's one of the things that they do. They look for excuses to keep contact with the person that has left them, right?
Different situation at the end of a relationship. People oftentimes don't let go right away. But I'd want to see how far it went and
I'm
What?
telling
You're gonna
you
tell
how
me.
far it went. That's
All
what
right.
the defendant testified to.
all right,
That she left things like groceries at his doorstep
all right.
for whatever reason. So again, even though the relationship is over, that indicates that there's still, on the part of the defendant, some action to keep contact, doesn't it?
Yes,
And again, if we take into account the 2 calls that were involved and now this contact, it does seem that there's the beginning of a pattern where the defendant is doing something in a positive fashion to keep the relationship going when the other party is done, right?
Objection, foundation, and timeline as to over what time period this is actually occurring.
Sustained.
Let's say it happened within a year, all right? Will you assume that?
that there's a year
No,
of constant
let me do it this way.
contact. But I'm
Assume
not
that
sure.
there's a breakup, there's the calls, they get back together, they break up again, and then there's this contact, leaving things at the door, and that all that happens, let's say, between 6 to 8 months apart, this whole thing. Assume that.
Okay,
And then assume that the defendant told us that they break up again, and that the individual, Bobby Juarez, moved to Medford. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know about Bobby Juarez. I don't know much about Bobby Juarez.
Well, assume that he moved to a place called Medford, Oregon. That
Okay.
was the testimony, correct? And he started to live with an individual by the name of Matthew McCartney. Do you know anything about that?
I do know about that.
Assume that after Mr. Juarez moved to Medford, Oregon, that the defendant, even though they'd broken up and she's living somewhere else, she began.
Mischaracterizes her testimony with regard to the breakup at that point.
Overruled again. The jury is directed to recall the testimony. You may continue.
After the breakup, and Mr. Juarez is in Medford, Oregon, living with Matthew McCartney, she testified that she then started going there on weekends. Assume that. Doesn't that begin to show a pattern of, number one, telephone calls, then contact at the door, and then after the individual, and they're broken up, moves away, she's still trying to keep contact. Doesn't that, and this is over a period of many months, isn't that the beginnings of a pattern?
Objection, Judge. Mischaracterizing Ms. Arias' testimony as to when the breakup occurred. They were not broken up at that point when she was traveling. So the hypothetical is not true.
Approach, please.
Sustained. You may
And
continue.
assume that they were broken up when Mr. Juarez moved to Medford. Assume that, okay? Will you do that as part of the hypothetical? Isn't that a pattern developing here on the part of the defendant? A jealous sort of pattern where Mr. Juarez and her are broken up. She's making telephone calls. And after making telephone calls, she then starts bringing him stuff over to his house. And then after he moves away, she goes to the area where he has moved to. Assume that. Wouldn't that be the beginning of a pattern?
But they're not broken up.
No, I just said they were.
But that's the hypothetical.
Yes.
The hypothetical, because in reality, they're not.
You
correct?
believe that they're not, but let's assume that hypothetically speaking, they are broken up.
Would that be the beginning of a pattern?
Yes.
It could be the beginning of a pattern.
Let's talk about Matthew McCartney. You're familiar with the relationship involving the defendant and Mr. McCartney, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, the defendant sort of went from Mr. Juarez and started dating Mr. McCartney, right?
Correct.
And there came a point when they started dating that, for whatever reason, there was going to be a breakup, right?
Correct.
And it was the defendant who refused to accept the breakup, correct?
She had a hard time with the breakup.
In other words, he wanted to break up and she did not, right?
Correct.
And when they were going through this process, he believed that they were already broken up, right?
When,
Objection made.
He, at some
Sustained.
point, they broke up at some point, didn't they?
yes.
And after they broke up, the defendant then confronted somebody by the name of Bianca, correct?
Correct.
Objection to state's testimony after the breakup.
Overruled.
And I don't think it was a confrontation.
I didn't say the confrontation, but it's after the breakup that Ms. Arias, according to you, goes and talks to Bianca, right?
Objection is characterizing the testimony.
I'm not talking about testimony, I'm talking about her understanding it,
Overruled.
right?
I'm not sure if they were broken up or not. I only know that she went and talked to Bianca. She talked to Bianca about the breakup. Yeah, I guess it was a breakup. She went to talk about, she said it was cheating, and she went to talk to Bianca about the cheating.
Do you remember writing about this in your notes?
I'm sure that I did.
And isn't it true that your notes indicate that,
Objection reading something that's not marked.
Overruled.
isn't it true that your notes indicate that they had already broken up when this talk between the defendant and Bianca took place?
I'd need to see my notes.
Okay? Take a look at Exhibit 613.
Are you asking me to just look at the highlighted section, or do you want me to read the entire thing?
What's that?
Do you want me to just read the highlighted section or the entire thing?
I want you to focus on the highlighted section, and then, if you want, read the whole thing.
All right.
And isn't it true that there was this breakup, correct, between her and Mr. McCartney, correct? Yes or no?
Yes.
And isn't it true that it was after this breakup that there was this conversation between the defendant and Bianca, correct?
Correct.
Isn't that part of a pattern of jealous behavior in confronting somebody?
It didn't sound like a confrontation either by Mr. McCartney or Miss Arias. It sounded like she went and had a talk with her, maybe clarified, I don't know.
Miss-
But I didn't get the jealous behavior. I got the going to talk to someone. It wasn't, if it was real jealous, it seems like it would have been more confrontational.
So,
It's not described that way.
Mr. McCartney wasn't present for that one, was he?
No, but he said it wasn't.
Right. And it was based on what the defendant told him, right?
I would
told-
suspect he talked to Bianca as well.
Pardon?
I would suspect he talked to his own girlfriend about it.
Again, now you're assuming, because it's to the benefit of the defendant, that Mr. McCartney spoke to Bianca. You don't know that, do you?
I know that Mr. McCartney said that it wasn't
Right.
an adversarial situation.
Right. And the issue with that is he wasn't present, correct?
No, he wasn't.
Any information he would have received would have come either from the defendant or perhaps from Bianca, if he spoke with Bianca, correct?
Correct.
So anything that he knows secondhand, correct?
Correct.
And after this confrontation, isn't it true that the defendant went at some point, shortly after that, and slept in Mr. McCartney's bed without his permission?
Yes.
Again, isn't that, given in light of what happened with Mr. Juarez, and in light of what's happening here with Mr. McCartney, doesn't that suggest to you a pattern of jealousy?
It suggests a pattern of having a very difficult time letting go. But she's not controlling anyone with her jealousy. She's not controlling them.
Let me talk to you about another example. Take a look at this exhibit, 614. You recognize it?
Yes, the continuum.
And it's the same one that we talked about before, right?
Yes.
The only difference is that this one is clearer, correct?
Clearer?
In other words, the letters are clear. It's,
There aren't any exacerbating factors on it.
there's no what?
There's no exacerbating factors on
Right.
it.
Other than that, and that's the other change, but other than that, it's just a clear presentation of the items in the up and down fashion, right?
Judge Bates, she had the original exhibit to compare.
Yes.
Judge, I don't want her to compare to the original. I'm just saying, isn't this something that that she's familiar with?
All right, overruled.
This is something you're familiar with and you put together, correct?
Yes, it's incomplete.
And
That's fine.
that's fine, it's incomplete, but this is something you put together, correct?
Yes.
All right. I move for the admission of Exhibit 614.
Judge, may we approach?
614 is admitted.
Now, you indicated that that was, with regard to what we've been talking about, the defendant, that was not necessarily a pattern of jealousy, correct?
Correct.
Actually, what we're really talking about is that's a pattern of stalking, isn't it?
No, it isn't.
Well, she's gone and contacted Bobby Juarez on the telephone 2 times after the breakup, right?
She has.
And she's left things at his door after they've broken up, correct?
Stalking implies fear.
Yes or no?
Stalking implies
Yes
fear.
or no?
Incorrect.
She's clearly
Stalking
saying
is about fear.
Yes, what's the objection?
The objection is she clearly cannot answer the question with a yes or no answer.
All right. Overruled. Restate your question.
Isn't it true that she, with regard to Mr. Juarez, she left things at his doorstep, correct?
Yes.
And isn't it true that with regard to Mr. McCartney, one of the things that she did is that she went and spoke to the person that she believed that he was seeing, correct?
Correct.
And then she slept in his bed, right?
She did.
And with regard to Mr. Alexander, isn't it true that one of the things that you know with regard to the Reagan Housling instant messaging was that Mr. Alexander was exceedingly afraid because of the defendant's stalking behavior?
Overruled. You may.
I don't know that he's exceedingly afraid. I don't get,
Judge, may I then ask her I think we'll need to approach him.
Yes, all right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take the evening recess. During the break, did you have an opportunity to look at your schedules for the dates I indicated earlier? Let's start with this Friday, April 12th, from 9:30 to 12:30. Is there anyone who could not be here from 9:30 to 12:30 this Friday? All right, thank you. Please plan to be here. For April 26th, from 9 to 4, is there anyone who could not be here? Thank you. Please plan to be here. Now, May 3rd, it appears we may not need that date, but is there anyone who has a problem with that date? Excuse me. All right, please keep that on your calendar as well. All right, please remember the admonition. Have a nice evening. Tomorrow morning, 9:30. Have a nice evening. Recess, you are free to go. Thank you.